To output feedback upon our validation result, I have to go to my input component. And there, for each input element, I in the end want to add a special class to that element if it is invalid. So my classes here have to become more dynamic. In the end, I will add a new constant, which I'll name input classes, which is an array, which at the beginning is just classes input element. I always want to attach this. Now on the individual elements here, I'll replace classes input element with my array. So with my input classes, this array I just created here, and I'll join it with a white space. So to concatenate all my string classes into one long string where the classes are separated. Now input classes also needs to receive the invalid property if the input is invalid. And I'll do this with an if check. That check is independent of the type of the input, so I only need to do it once at the beginning. I'll check if props invalid is set to true. If it is, then I'll push a new class to my input classes, the invalid CSS class. And of course, not like that. Classes invalid. I need to define that class. So now this is pushed to my input classes, which are then attached in a string way to my elements. For that, I need to receive an invalid prop, which is true or false. And I also need to define some styling. So I'll simply go to my input element or to the CSS file for the input component and add an invalid class. That's the class I'm referring to here, the class I try to push to my array. Now there you can set up any style you want. I'll simply set up a border, which is 1 pixel, solid and red maybe, and a background color of a light red, maybe salmon. Let's have a look. Can even choose a little bit of a lighter red, something like that. Now, to see that effect, I have to go back to the contact data, and there I now need to pass that invalid property to the input I render. So here I'll add invalid, and invalid is some data I again now have on my form element. On the form element in the config object, which, just as a reminder, refers to that object here on the right in our state order form property. There we have this valid property. Valid, of course, tracks whether the form is valid or not. I want to pass an invalid property, so I will access valid and then reverse it by adding an exclamation mark at the beginning to turn true to false and false to true, because I'm passing the opposite. With that, let's save this and let's go back to the app. And now everything is invalid at the beginning, which makes sense. As soon as I enter something though, things become valid, the zip code only after 5 characters and not with more. So we can see that now indeed we are correctly returning information about the validity. We also see though that it's not that friendly to start with a page which or with a form that's just red. We also see that our dropdown is always red, even though we have no validation rules there. So we definitely need some fine-tuning. Let's start with the dropdown. We shouldn't always add invalid. Props invalid, true or false, that's nice to have. But we have an issue in cases like our dropdown where we have no rules. So what I should also check if it's invalid, and if we maybe have like props should validate property. I now can set up should validate in my contact data as an additional property I pass to my input. And should validate should only be true if my object in the order form has a validation object. My delivery method, which is the dropdown in the end, hasn't. So it shouldn't validate at all. So here I will simply pass form element config validation. And if the validation property isn't set as for my dropdown, this will return true or false, and therefore this if check in my input component here will not run, and I will never get the invalid class. So now we can see the dropdown is not treated as invalid anymore. We also have the issue that everything is invalid right from the start, so we should also track whether an input has been touched by the user or not. Let's do this in the next lecture.